Good evening, everyone. I am Andrea Hancock-Creer, president of Mu Lambda Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to Lines Redefined, a conversation about the implications of redistricting for the Black community. Alpha Kappa Alpha has a rich history of uplifting issues and being on the front lines to address the concerns of our community from our inception as an organization in 1908 up to the present day. And much of this work is accomplished through our Connections and Social Action Committee, and we'll be meeting our chairman shortly. We are delighted to bring together community leaders to discuss how the outcome of the 2020 census and the drawing of new district lines as a result of that, what does this mean for the Black community and how does this impact our political power? So we are excited to explore this tonight. We have joined forces with several organizations to bring this evening to you, and I'd like to take this opportunity to uplift them at this time. I want to thank Los Angeles African American Women Political Action Committee, or LAWPAC, the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, Phi Beta Sigma chapter of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated, and our co-sponsor, the Mu Sigma Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. We so appreciate this collaboration and what it means to have some of the brightest minds coming together to engage in this critical analysis. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Atoy Wilson of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, Mu Sigma Lambda chapter, who is the chairman of their initiative, A Voteless People is a Hopeless People. So now I'll turn it over to Atoy to bring you greetings, and thank you again for joining us tonight. Atoy?
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am the chairman of A Voteless People is a Hopeless People, which is one of Alpha's 4 national programs. It was a program that was established back in the 1930s when, as many of us know, many African Americans had the right to vote, but were prevented from doing so because of different obstacles and barriers, such as poll taxes, threats of retaliation, and even an unfortunate general lack of education about the voting process. So initially, voter registration was at the forefront. But over the years, as times have changed, the national program sort of expanded. And in the 1990s, the focus actually shifted to include political awareness and empowerment, which was delivered through town meetings and candidate forums. So this sort of fell under the general umbrella of voter education, which remains one of the top priorities for Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. I think we would all agree that one of the most dangerous things could be an uneducated voter. So I think, you know, the brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated are very, very excited to be part of tonight's panel and presentation to learn about topics that maybe your average layperson may not be fully informed about, the intricacies about such things as redistricting and the census and how those have an actual impact on our local Black communities. So if anyone would like to know a little bit more about our national program and our organization, please feel free to visit us at baldwinhillsalphas.com. And at this time, I would like to take the pleasure to introduce the next speaker, which is Buffany Hunter, who is a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Mu Lambda Omega chapter, and she is the chairman of the Connection and Social Action Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Atoy. Good evening, everyone. You are in for an informative conversation. Shakari Byerly, managing partner of Ubiquitous Public Opinion Research. Over the course of the last 15 years, Ms. Byerly has served as a pollster and political strategist for dozens of electoral campaigns, cities, local school districts, community college districts, public agencies, and nonprofit organizations across the country, with concentrated expertise in California. She is also highly familiar with on-the-ground issues related to the electoral representation, having designed and implemented voter targeting and field canvassing strategies on behalf of the California Democratic Party. Ms. Byerly also has unique expertise in issues related to California governance and political reform. Prior to her career in opinion research, she was the manager of the California Governance Project at the Center for Governmental Studies, CGS, a nonpartisan nonprofit research institute. While at CGS, Ms. Byerly co-authored several ascendant publications on redistricting reform and ballot initiative reform. She's a former board member of California Common Cause and was instrumental part of both the policy development and campaign consulting teams behind the successful passage of California's Proposition 11, which transferred authority over the state's redistricting process from the state legislature to an independent citizens committee. Ms. Byerly earned her master's degree in public policy from the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and a bachelor's degree cum laude in government from Dartmouth College. She is currently a PhD candidate in political science with concentrations in quantitative methods and research in American politics, as well as a master's degree in social statistics at UCLA. Lastly, she's a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, Nu Lambda Omega chapter. Shikari?
Good evening, and thank you, Buffany, for that gracious introduction. My name is Shikari Byerly, Managing Partner of Aviteris, and it's my pleasure to not only moderate tonight's panel, but to also introduce you to our highly distinguished panel of experts for this evening's discussion. First, we have Dr. Christine Slaughter. Dr. Slaughter is a political scientist at Princeton University. She's currently a jointly appointed postdoctoral research fellow in the Princeton Department of Political Science and the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, where she's working on a book manuscript based on her dissertation research, No Strangers to Hardship: African Americans, Inequality, and the Politics of Resilience. Her academic research on African American politics has garnered numerous awards. She's a Spelman College alumna and a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated Century City Alumni Chapter. We also have with us this evening Kristen Nimmers, who serves as a policy and campaign manager with the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub. She works with organizations across the state to engage in public advocacy, provide training, and help to coordinate civic engagement programs. Prior to joining the Hub, Kristen completed the Choral Fellowship in Public Affairs in San Francisco, where she worked on high-level consulting projects. Some of her work included national policy research on chronic absenteeism and its connection to state budgets, analyzing SFPD recruitment and hiring practices to provide recommendations on increasing diversity, community organizing around workers' rights in Oakland, and lobbying in Sacramento for policies around affordable housing and extending STEM programs for K through 12 students. Kristen earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and Communication from Humboldt State University, a JD from McGeorge Law School in Sacramento, with concentration in capital lawyering and public policy, and was a Choral Fellow. We also have with us this evening Patrice Marshall McKenzie. Pasadena is where Patrice's story begins and the place that cultivated her mindset of thinking and dreaming without limits on what is possible. As an educator and community advocate, Patrice uses her voice to speak on issues of equity, justice, and power building for marginalized members of her community. She also works tirelessly to educate her community about the power that everyday people possess and their capacity to accelerate change through participatory democracy. Patrice currently serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff for LAUSD board member, Dr. George McKenna. Patrice's community service includes several nonprofit boards, democratic activism, and supporting women candidates for public office. Ms. McKenzie is a graduate of UC Berkeley with a degree in African American Studies and holds an MPA degree from Barnard School of Public Affairs at the City University of New York. We also have tonight Dr. Anthony Samad, who's the Executive Director of the Mervyn Dimely African American Political and Economic Institute at Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. The Dimely Institute is a nonpartisan research think tank studying the history of African American politics in California and the social, political, and economic effects of public policy on the African American community. An author, columnist, documentarian, scholar, he is the author of 6 books, produced, written, and directed 4 films, written numerous scholarly articles, and over 1,100 editorial commentaries from 1991 to the present. He is the co-founder and director of the Urban Issues Forum of Greater Los Angeles, a nationally recognized public affairs discussion forum, a past president of the Los Angeles NAACP and 100 Black Men of Los Angeles, as well as a distinguished service chapter member of Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, the fraternity's highest honor. I want to start our conversation tonight with Dr. Slaughter. Dr. Slaughter, thank you for joining us this evening. My first question is, what is redistricting and what does it mean for Black political power, both nationally and in the local context?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sha'Carri, for that question. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel. So in order to, the baseline of what is redistricting and what it means for Black political power, first is that redistricting is the equalization of districts to reflect population changes. So thinking about how we define districts, these will be any electoral body. So that could be our precincts, it could be our congressional districts, our school board districts, our city council districts, any district where we elect our representatives. So next slide. Now, if we take a holistic and a broad view of what redistricting means for African Americans, we must start with thinking through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So essentially what the Voting Rights Act of 1965 established was, one, that African Americans had access to the ballot. That's what we fought and marched for, but also that we would be able to vote in districts that would represent our interests. So what redistricting essentially aims to do is to make sure that the districts where we live represent the communities that live within them. So California is unique in the sense that for this electoral cycle, there was an independent commission, We Draw the Lines California, that was in the process of redrawing the district maps. In other places, such as the American South, especially places such as Texas, this is held by the state legislature. And what that might mean, I think, as we've been seeing in our political climate, is that it could be some partisan bias in terms of how districts reflect the communities and what ways they're mangled. And one thing, we may commonly know about is gerrymandering. So that's one of the negative outputs of redistricting. So if we think back to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which established that African Americans would have access to the ballot without forms of intimidation, such as poll taxes, literacy tests, all other forms of intimidation tactics that were used, we know that this redistricting cycle was the first where we did not have some of the protections from the Voting Rights Act against counties that had previously in the past discriminated on the basis of race for African American voters. So what we can see in this top right corner, this goes back to 2013. So if we recall, in 2013, the Supreme Court took up the case Shelby County versus Eric Holder. And they essentially, Shelby County believed that because there was racial progress, we did not need the same protections that was in the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So it struck down several clearances that made it, that had federal government oversight for voting in elections. So one thing that this impacted, as we're seeing now, is redistricting and how districts are drawn. So we've seen it, if you saw the news of places like North Carolina, if you see how some districts are real mangled in areas such as Texas, even here in California, building a constituency looks a lot different across states. So why this may be important thinking about this year is that redistricting, how we get the population numbers, is a process from the census. And if we can recall back to when many organizations were mobilizing Black folks to get active in the census, it was tough. One, who we had as our president at the time had political aims behind who could participate and be counted in the census, but also we were still in the throes of the coronavirus, which shaped how people were contacted in order to be counted. So why might this matter in terms of political power today? If there was, which thankfully there wasn't, an undercount in certain communities, that would impact how our districts are being drawn today, or how they have been drawn. So this necessarily was not a case here in California, but in other places, this may have been a potential issue that undercounted the amount of African Americans living in a community, which will then impact how their electoral districts are drawn and how their representatives are allocated. But what we do know is that even if there is an undercount, there are also political motivations behind redistricting, and particularly where Black elected officials have gained traction, it is the case that we may see the Republican Party using redistricting as a tool to gerrymander districts to make African Americans vote matters less and to make it so that they cannot elect the candidates of their choice. Next slide. So thinking about here in Los Angeles, in California more broadly, now that we have a picture of the national landscape, thinking about the population dynamics that have changed in Los Angeles that may impact the way that our districts are shaped, is that we know that Black Americans are only 10% of eligible voters in the county. So Latinx people represent the largest share of voters in Los Angeles. But we also know that there are multiple civic and social organizations based in LA that have gone to improve the lives of African Americans. But if we think about who and what communities are present in LA, white households have a median net worth of around $355,000 compared to $4,000 for Black households. So if we think about how we're able to elect candidates that represent our interests, thinking about recreational spending in order to finance and support campaigns, Black households simply do not have the excess funds in order to support campaigns that we see some other communities being able to leverage. Also, if we think about the population dynamics in Los Angeles, Black Angelenos have moved out from the city center, moving towards the suburbs. So thinking going back to 1980, there's been over a 26% decrease in Black Angelenos living within the city of Los Angeles. So that might impact how Black Americans are represented in Southern California, since there's a greater disbursement of Black people in Southern California. If we also think about who we know are Black Americans' strongest voting bloc, Black women, particularly in Southern California, are more likely to live in poverty. And this has particularly been exacerbated by the pandemic, particularly with underemployment, unemployment, or lower wages. So here we might see the folks who are most likely to turn out may not be able to, one, have the time, money, or resources to contribute to campaigns, but also to support candidates that represent their interests. And even though these are the conditions that African Americans face, California is still the 6th most populous state of African Americans. But again, we know folks are moving out of the state. Thinking about folks moving to Texas, y'all have seen it. Folks moving to Nevada, folks going back to the South. That's impacting particularly our politics here and how we're able to support candidates that represent our interests. And also one perilous problem is thinking about homelessness, and particularly if most of the Black population, well, not most, but if there's a considerable portion of African Americans experiencing homelessness and displacement, those are folks who, one, are not being politically represented, but two, also are not having a dedicated representation at the city, state, local level to support remedying this issue that's impacting African Americans particularly. Next slide. So what are some potential political impacts for future elections if we just were to take a broad swath from what we know about California, what we know about Los Angeles in particular, and what we know about just generally thinking about Black political power more broadly, is that we know that if there's a greater disbursement in African Americans who are not able to support candidates at every level that represent our interests, this could potentially misrepresent the interests of the Black community on multiple levels. Second, we know if there is a greater disbursement, if elections become competitive, is it going to be a situation where African-American candidates can emerge and be successful? So what we know about Black candidates is that they start at the local level. So we start from our school board, move on to city council, move on to other roles. Are we able to get folks elected in lower level elections in order so that we can build their political profile? Is the African-American vote being diluted? That is, do we see one district representing a small swath, another district representing a small swath? There isn't a consensus of what representation for the Black community looks like. And is a district a meaningful constituency? We've seen it to where if it looks like, it's mangled and it's something that we can't necessarily make a shape out of, how is that being defined as a community? These are questions that now that we're going to be able to see the electoral maps that are publicly available and also have a midterm primary coming up very soon, we'll elect potentially a new mayor, hopefully a Black woman mayor. Do we have the base in order to do that as Black people, in order to have our seat at the table? So last slide. Placing all of this together, what I think is most important and what I'm looking forward to hearing from other folks on the panel is how we can continue to be persistent in our fight, both in and outside of the electoral system, for representation and for Black interests. So with that, I look forward to continuing the panel and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Slaughter. Those numbers and that analysis, I think, is so critical to setting the table for our conversation. I'd like to invite the other panelists to join us on camera. And my first question is for Christian Nimmers. Research suggests that African Americans and Black immigrants in California were among the groups at the highest risk of being undercounted in the census and also potentially most at risk for vote dilution. We're fortunate to have you, Kristen, on our panel, given that the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub was a critical organization in helping to mobilize and maximize participation both in the census and the redistricting process. Kristen, tell us about your work at the Hub and share with us what you saw as the challenges and the triumphs of the 2021 redistricting process, and what should we be doing to better position ourselves going forward?
Thank you for the question, and thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this panel. As the Hub, we worked with coalition partners across the state in key regions like LA, the Bay, San Diego, Inland Empire, and the Central Valley to organize advocacy to the State Commission, engage the community in this redistricting process, and ultimately drew statewide maps for State Assembly, State Senate, congressional seats, specifically to ensure that Black communities were kept together and districted in ways that didn't dilute Black voting power. And just as Dr. Slaughter just mentioned, to make sure that it really wasn't gerrymandered and that it was considerate of Black communities. And I think some of the challenges are also some things that Dr. Slaughter touched on, but just data was a big issue on this redistricting cycle because the census was heavily impacted not only by the pandemic, but also by the presidential administration and the political climate. So there was a significant undercount of Black people, which is compounded by the fact that Black people are already harder to count in the census because we make up significant portions of the hardest to count communities. So for example, houseless communities, formerly incarcerated folks, immigrants, especially in LA, where we have like the highest Black immigrant population, and in San Diego, where there's also a significant Black immigrant population. And so, due to that undercount and the redistricting being based on that census data, we had to do a lot of work to not only identify the boundaries of different Black communities in the state, but also to justify those communities to the commission and justify the boundaries that we were saying, where the data might not have matched up with what we know to be true for folks that are actually living in those areas. And then I think another issue is also just the length of the process. So, census data was delayed. And the redistricting process extended, half a year, almost a year over what it was supposed to be. And it's already a difficult process to understand. It's already something that a lot of folks don't know about. And so keeping folks engaged throughout that was really difficult. I know folks have Zoom fatigue and tired of these virtual events and things like that. But it was hard to keep folks engaged in that process and focused and understanding the importance throughout the length of time that it was extended. and like mobilize folks. But I do think that we still, like Black organizations and Black residents, engage this process in a historical way, like due to the hub, but also other Black organizations that were involved. So we had a lot of wins in the final map in terms of keeping Black communities together and bringing together communities that were like previously split between multiple districts. And so we've got to increase our voice in a lot of, in many places. And I think we've built like a foundation that'll enable us to keep engaging in this process in the future. You know, like now Black folks are thinking about this process. You know, we have panels like this where we're really like engaging around like what we can prepare for and how we think about this process. So I think that it'll be more equitable in the future as we like continue to engage and like dig into this work. And then in terms of like what we should be doing to better position us for the next redistricting cycle, I think we need to really be paying attention to how we fare in these districts over the next 10 years. So a lot of this is really theoretical, like it's based on data, but we've drawn lines based on what we think will help folks and what we think will allow folks to like elect people who can tackle the different issues that we face, but paying attention to like how we fare. Are we able to actually elect folks that prioritize our issues and address those issues? And then also paying attention to like where and how Black communities are shifting. So, you know, gentrification in the Bay and LA has caused a lot of shifts from folks to moving to the Central Valley, moving to the Inland Empire. And even though we think of California as like this progressive state, there are a lot of like rural and conservative areas in California. And so like as Black folks are moving out of these urban centers, they are moving into more conservative areas. And so just like thinking about like how Black communities are shifting and how we're protecting, you know, our voices in those areas as well to make sure that we're still getting folks elected that will address our different issues.
That's, you know, it's so important to engage our communities. I'd love to have Patrice Marshall McKenzie weigh in on some of these issues. Patrice, you served as a commissioner on the City of Pasadena's task force and brought much needed diversity to that work. What was your experience like as a commissioner, and how can we improve relationships between communities, elected officials, and appointed leaders to really maximize our impact, especially going into the June primary election cycle this year?
Thank you so much for the question, Sha'Carri. I feel like a lot of the things that Kristen experiences and she shared are things that I experienced serving on the task force for the City of Pasadena's redistricting process. I was invited to serve on that task force because when they initially seeded the task force, there were no Black people at all that were recommended in the first round. And there was a huge community outcry. And I was fortunate to have been recommended by a number of members of council, as well as the mayor, to be added to the council, as well as two other people, another Black man and a Latina woman. So having recognized that the voice of communities of color was significantly underrepresented, I knew that it was my obligation to make sure that I was speaking out for Black people, making sure that I'm protecting the interests of Black people, and looking to make sure that we are able to create opportunities for districts to be drawn that would allow Black folks to have an appropriate voice in the electoral process. One of the other things that was very difficult, to Kristen's point about the census process having been on a distorted calendar, is that it really, really compressed the amount of time for redistricting to take place. So we literally had like 5.5 months to do what you would have done ordinarily in an 18-month process. So that means that the time for community engagement was significantly reduced. So in the time that you would have had to do sort of some basic outreach to sort of get folks familiar with the process, let them know what it is, why they should care, find some ways to sort of make it sexy and sort of engaging for them, we had to do the outreach, hold the community meetings, get folks to give their input, teach them why they should give their input, and actually get the comments to come back in all in a matter of probably 30 days. So that compressed timeline didn't really give us a chance to sort of help people really turn that corner in terms of knowing that while the census is important and people are responding to the census, even though there was definitely an undercount of Black people in the 2020 census, we haven't fully turned that corner yet with helping people understand the importance of redistricting. So my hope is that as we look to the 2030 cycle, yes, we're thinking about 2030 right now, that we are thinking about how do we get people in line, ready and prepared to know when it's coming, know what to look for, know how to follow along in terms of the level of government they're interested in, be it local, state, or federal, and how do you give your input? How do you give your public testimony? Why is it important for regular people to give their public testimony? Why does it matter for you to say, hi, my name is Sha'Carri. I live in Los Angeles. It's important to me to have a district that represents XYZ. This is what I want to see in an elected leader. Why is it important to have that kind of comments come in from people who look like us? Because other folks are doing it. And if they're speaking loudly and we're not talking at all, our interests can be very easily ignored. There were many, many times in many meetings where I had to speak up and say, just because you did not see 100 letters come in from folks who live in these parts of the community doesn't mean that they're not involved. They don't care about their neighborhoods. They don't care about what their districts look like. They don't care about who represents them. Other things that we were very concerned about with the undercount is the rationale that people tried to raise was, well, we're building all these units of housing, so the districts will balance out eventually. Mm-hmm. And I and my colleague were very clear about saying, let us not forget that Black communities in Pasadena in particular have been displaced due to the construction of the 210 freeway. Our business districts were displaced. The Northwest district, where people have now migrated to, is starting to look different due to housing affordability. It's also been impacted by other redevelopment decisions that were made over time that have had adverse impacts, and that we weren't going to allow the preferences of new people who live in what's considered downtown Pasadena to say, we deserve our own council district, and have the drawing of that district have another adverse impact on Black communities. So we stood firm and said, absolutely not. If we can't draw a district that will not have an adverse impact, this is not happening. And unfortunately, we weren't able to find a way that we could draw that district without having an impact on Black people that was adverse. So business as usual carried on in Pasadena. But I will say that the most important thing in terms of how do we get ourselves ready for the 2022 election is that we have to remember that there is no off year for elections, and every election matters, be it school board, city council, judicial elections, county supervisor, state assembly, state senate, your statewide constitutional officers, so your lieutenant governor, secretary of state, state controller, state treasurer, all of those offices really, really matter. And while we know that we have people who serve and represent us at the local level, those numbers get a little bit more sparse at the state level. We need to make sure that at those key policy making areas that we have people who are serving our interests. So we need to think about who is running for office at all those levels of government. We also need to be realistic about the fact that LA County has 88 cities. Every person who runs and wins as Black is not going to run in the city of LA. We need to be looking at how do we find ways to incubate, support, and run candidates who can represent districts across the totality of Los Angeles County. I want to see Black people running and winning and serving in as many of those 88 cities as possible. And we also need to know that this ongoing engagement process with our elected leaders is not transactional. It is ongoing, it is sustained, and you have to have that dialogue open, not just when you're mad, not when you need something, and not just because you care today. It's an ongoing relationship that you have to build. It's an ongoing opportunity to have dialogue and communication, and we have to be better about having that communication be ongoing and through line versus having it only be sort of like sound bites and intermittent. So my charge would be, make sure that you are communicating with your elected leaders and your appointed leaders ongoing, consistently, and as often as you can.
Thank you so much, Patrice. Dr. Samad, the Mervyn Dimely Institute is one of the few well-established academic institutes in the state focused squarely on the impact of politics and public policy for Black Californians. Do the new district, where do we stand today with Black political power given the districts that we have? And what's at stake as we head into the June 2022 primary elections? What can people do to maximize our impact? And you're on mute, Dr. Samad.
First of all, thank you to the AKAs for inviting me to this panel. I feel very privileged to be on such a distinguished panel of women. That means a lot to me. Thank you for the opportunity. What we got to draw context in this, okay? Because redistricting, this is the first time many people have even heard anything about redistricting. And we have to begin to engage political systems on a continual basis. The census has been around since 1790. Every 10 years, we count the population. But it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that we had a full seat at the table. We had partial seats depending on the sectionality of the country, whether it was the West or the East Coast, Midwest, South. And so within one census cycle, the hands that picked cotton elected a president, the first Southern president in 100 years, which was Jimmy Carter. So Black votes matter. Now, when we talk about the policy implications of the census, okay, there is an intermix there that deals with policy, population shifts, and policy reconciliation. And the policy reconciliation is the reapportionment process and the redistricting process. This is to ensure that all states are equally weighted in terms of resources. It's all about representation and resources, money, federal money, where federal money goes. California, for the first time in its history, in 170 years, lost a congressional seat in the census, okay? And so, whereas historically we either gained a congressional seat or we sustained whatever congressional representation we had. And so what does that mean? That means we're going to lose money. California is the #1 in the nation in poverty. Some of the earlier statistics that were given by Dr. Slaughter as it relates to economic subjugation essentially bears out the fact that Black people don't have the means to contribute to campaign contributions at the same rates that other community. But politics is more than just giving to candidates. Politics is more than just turning out because you know somebody who's on the ballot. And we oftentimes have oriented our communities to go out and vote for candidates and pay lesser attention to ballot initiatives and statewide propositions. And that is where we're getting beat. We're not getting beat in the front rooms, we're getting beat in the back rooms because in many cities in California, you don't necessarily have to have a Black majority. You just have to have an attentive public. We have two women that are the Mayor Fontana and the Mayor Rialto, and there's not a significant Black population out there. However, they've positioned themselves to be vocal when the time comes and demonstrate leadership in that way. So we have to do a better job of preparing our communities to be fully engaged. One of the things that the Dimely Institute is doing is we're partnering with community organizations, particularly Sanctuary of Hope, to do a Thinking Lives Matter efficacy project. And this is basically to teach people, how to stay engaged year round and not just at election time. If there wasn't for 2 Black women who were on the county redistricting committee, we would have lost the 2nd district because they were outnumbered and they were, in many instances, outvoted. But we were able to raise the attention through the Dimely Institute and other community vehicles to bring attention to the slight gerrymandering that was taking place, that was, splitting the Black communities and taking historically Black communities like the city of Carson out of the 2nd district, the university out of the 2nd district. So it was real clear to us that there was a play. Now, the mistake that we make is that we think people are involved in politics for altruistic reasons. And there is a place for altruism, but politics is not the place. Basically, people are in politics to divide up power. And so we cannot assume that some of our historical partnerships that we have a converging interest in, particularly the Latinx community and the Asian Pacific Islander communities, don't have competing interests when it comes to political representation. And we're going to begin to see that. You have to remember the history is that the Latino community had to sue in order to get a seat on the County Board of Supervisors, the Maldeff case in 1991. That's what created the Gloria Molina seat, the 1st district, okay? We can anticipate the Asian Pacific Islander community to sue next because their population is actually higher than the African-American population. And there seems to be a common belief that African-Americans are now overrepresented at the county levels and at several city levels. And so we have to be on our game to be able to hold the power that we have. And that is going to require consistent dialogues. The likelihood is that the seat that is going away from California is going to cause Southern California to lose a congressional seat. That seat is going to shift to Northern California. Now, for those of you who don't remember, we lost the seat after the 2010 census. They merged Janice Hahn's seat and Laura Richardson's seat. And so we lost political representation there. There is discussions that they're going to merge Maxine Water and Karen Bass's district, which means then we'll lose another seat. And so we have to be aware, of what the play is about to take place. One of the things that we know is that at the city of Los Angeles level, there were some subtle gerrymandering that pitted 2 Black elected officials against each other in the 8th and the 9th. And some assets from the 8th were shifted into the 9th, already knowing that the Black councilman in the 9th is going to be the last Black councilman in that seat. That seat is going to go Latino in the next election, as soon as this particular councilman is turned out. And so you see people playing us early. We know that the 8th district most likely will remain African-American and hopefully the 10th. But the days that we see 3 African-American council people on the Los Angeles City Council, those days are numbered. And so they're loading up bordering districts with the assets, because the assets are important. They create the tax base, as well as they create opportunity to bring in state and federal funds. And those districts without assets generally become impoverished. And so those are the things that we need to pay attention to.
Several comments have come in from the chat about how we can engage and be connected given the new districts and the fact that the process was so short for us to engage during redistricting. Patrice, what can everyday citizens be doing today to maximize their impact in the political process, given the districts that we have and some of the potential losses that may have occurred because of our shrinking concentration in Los Angeles County?
I think there's a couple of things. One, there was a discussion about the population of Latino residents in the city. I think there's a difference between Latino residents and the Latino voting age population. And there definitely is a drop off between the voting age population of Latinos and then the actual total population. While Black people may have a smaller total population, our voting age population remains strong. And we need to continue to cultivate that, to make sure that we remain educated, and also make sure that we are really, really dialing in to the local issues that are going to affect us, because our quality of life is really at the local level. All politics is local. You don't have to follow every single level of government, but the one that you are most interested in, pick it, follow it. Agendas for meetings are public. Now that people are meeting virtually, you can send your public comments in by email. There's a lot of different ways that you can communicate. You can send email. People are checking their social media handles and monitoring those. So you can have more direct access to your elected leaders and can articulate and communicate your concerns that way. So that sort of ongoing dialogue, I think, is where we really have the most value. And again, there is no such thing as an off election year, and to make sure that you are voting early, often, and doing so in an informed way.
Dr. Slaughter, we had a question come in, and I'd like you to weigh in first. Are Latino and Black interests aligned? Are Black people still supported by Latino representation? What's your view?
Well, this has been an ongoing conversation for 30 years since there was a Black Latino Alliance created by Mark Ridley Thomas and Antonio Villaraigosa when he was a labor leader. There are issues that cross both communities, and those issues are poverty, crime, healthcare, underemployment or unemployment. And so, you know, there was a time when African Americans and Latino did not have access to government jobs in a proportional manner. Those are the most secure jobs. And so we incurred economic subjugation. Economic subjugation simply is, you know, last hired, first fired, you know, pay us less, charge us more, work us harder, so we die sooner. And without certain things like preventive health care and, you know, poor schools, and of course, the prison industrial complex, our communities deal with a lot of issues. However, as the Latinx community grew, instead of looking at the broader pie, they began to look at what we had, which was problematic. And then they started advocating for population parity. And as Patrice said, you know, there is a difference between Latino residents and Latino voters, given that California has an extremely large undocumented population. Probably the only state that has anything equivalent to what we have is Texas. And so the face of the state has changed, but the politics, you know, has shifted, you know, in a way that continues to keep the emphasis on white representation, even though the white population has shrunk over the last 3 censuses in California. And so there's this notion that white people can represent everybody, but people of color can only represent their identities and somehow can't represent white people. And we have to change that notion to where it's about the best candidate, not necessarily play, race politics when it comes to political representation. So the Black community and the Latino community have to figure that out because they came for us this time. MALDEF came for 3 supervisorial seats, and one of them was ours. And they did get another seat, but they didn't get ours. But that doesn't mean they won't come next time. And so we have to be vocal and not bashful when there are subtle race plays and have people say we're interjecting race when there's nothing else that you can interject. It is an identity politics play.
I'd like to have Dr. Slaughter weigh in for us. We have a question in the chat and a comment. Districts determine how communities are counted, but it isn't a safe bet that a community will vote together. What are strategies that assist in unifying the vote? Christine.
Yes, thank you. No, that's a great question that came in through the chat. And as I was thinking about it, I think one of the richest things in the Black tradition is that we're able to have debate and also have different discussion and emerge new ideas. So if we think about how can we unify the vote, first we're thinking about, is it necessary that there is one cohesive voice for multiple Black communities that face multiple issues? I'm not going to say that what the issues that I face as a Black millennial are the same as folks who experience houselessness and displacement. So how can one privileging one particular group of Black Americans, one particular Black community, how can we do so without further harming other folks who are essential to the Black community who may not have the same access to get on the platform such as this, right? So thinking about, is it something that we vote together? It's necessary, but it's not the main condition towards Black progress. We must, one, be able to understand that folks can support whatever leader they feel is more equipped to represent their interests. And if that's not coalescing around a preferred candidate, or if it's not an essential Black candidate or someone who's been networked for over 40 years, we just have to learn how to move and skip with whoever can represent our interests, if it's for our most marginal folks or if it's for folks who have been established long-term. So I think it's a great question, but it's something that we have to really grapple with. Is it necessary to have a unified voice in order to advance Black interest?
Thank you for that, Dr. Slaughter. We have another question in the chat, and Kristen, I'm wondering if you can weigh in from David DeLuz. Where is our numerical strength? Is our center of power the city of LA? Is that shifting to the Inland Empire, for example?
Yeah, good question. I feel like we can't think of our numerical strength as in terms of just one area, but we should be thinking about our numerical strength within each district at these different levels. So for example, if there's an assembly district where we have like 30% of the voting population, then our votes will make a difference. Our votes will elect someone. And so how are we leveraging the power that we have in terms of the percentage of folks within that district to make sure that our issues are heard and to make sure that we're electing someone that's going to care about those issues. But then also I think to Patricia's point around there being no off years, you also have to be engaged throughout the process continually. So it isn't just that we got someone elected, but also how are we holding them accountable after that election? Because if they just use us to kind of win the margin and to win the election, but aren't afterwards then being held accountable by that same community and by those constituents that say, hey, we can vote you out, we have enough power to make sure that you're not actually that elected, then making sure that we're also leveraging power afterwards. This is a year-round process. And I think, that's kind of a critique of just the way that we do campaigning and engage the community, and the fact that we're just kind of talking to folks in the months before and after an election, but also need to continue to engage folks year-round in the entire process of implementation of policies and in holding electeds accountable to whatever platforms that they're setting. So.
We have another question that's come in from the chat from Christian Lewis. Do people most identify with issues or with race? Based on the last speaker's response, I'm wondering how to rally particular support for a particular candidate. Dr. Samad, would you like to weigh in on that question?
Absolutely. One of the things that we do as it relates to politics is we look at politics through outdated paradigms. The 20th century was about race. The 21st century is about class. Okay, so communities that are impoverished, irrespective of their race, they tend to bind together, just as affluent communities tend to bind together, irrespective of race. There are some issues that do impact us. Immigration impacts us, even though Black people can't talk about immigration for fear of offending their Latino counterparts, but that creates competition for work. And in many instances, you have an immigrant population that will take work for less. And then once they get the jobs, then they advocate for higher wages, whereas Black people are not going to take, work for less because they understand their worth. One of the things that we're working with Evitarists on is what is called a racial retrogression study. And right now, Black people in America and in California are living in the same space that they lived in 100 years ago in 1919. Okay. Everything being relative, yes, we do have a greater access, but those access are of a few. The masses are still in the same place they were in 1919. We see the return of race riots. We see the return of white nationalism. We see the return, of nepotism politics and favoritism politics that oftentimes excludes African Americans because African Americans don't have the kind of networks that these other communities have. And so what we have to do, there is no reason for white wealth, to be 400 times, that of Black wealth. Well, if you go through decades and decades of suppressed wages, you see how that can happen. You see how economic subjugation occurs, okay? You see the cost of healthcare. People like to say Obama didn't do anything for us. The Affordable Health Care Act was about us, okay? Because Black people didn't have healthcare because they couldn't afford healthcare, okay? And there's some that still can't afford it, even with Obamacare, okay? So we have to understand the nuances between policy formation and policy implementation. And then we have to evaluate whether that policy works. We're currently doing that with homelessness policy. We're currently doing that with recreational cannabis policy. Those are failed policies that we haven't corrected quick enough, and they have adversely impacted our community more than other communities.
We have, thank you so much for that. We have time, I think, for one more question. And we have a note about the untapped political power of our African and our Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latinx communities. I'd like to direct this next question to Patrice. We have our Black immigrant communities. What are the other untapped kind of communities among African Americans, among Black population in California and Los Angeles in particular, and how can we get people more connected to the process to maximize our impact?
I think that to Dr. Samad's point that there is not one sort of singular Black experience or one singular sort of Black population, and being able to have conversations where we can be in coalition around issues of alignment, and also being able to have people engage where there is commonality, and also be okay with knowing that there may be some differences. Like every issue is not going to be everybody's issue, and that's okay. But where there is commonality, it does make sense to build those coalitions. And being able to know when you're building coalition, where there's value and where there's not value for you. Sometimes you have to step forward, sometimes you have to step back. And I think that we have to be smarter about really identifying what it is we want to gain out of coalition building and gain out of those sorts of alliances, and making sure that there's clear conversation about expectations, outcomes, and what it is that people are willing to invest, be it person power, mobilization, engagement, dollars, et cetera, to make sure that the yield on the back end is going to be what you're putting in, and that it's mutual in terms of there being some mutual sort of beneficial effort that's expended to get to where you want to go in terms of the back end result.
Thank you so much for that. I think we can indeed squeeze in one more question that just came through. And I'm going to direct this to Kristen. What role can faith-based organizations play in building community and organizing?
Really good question. I feel like they could play a really big role. I think in the census process and in the redistricting process, we really got to see how much being a trusted messenger matters to our community. Like folks who are within the community are trusted as voices for the community more than, outsiders coming in. And so faith communities really can be able to speak to their congregations about the importance of being politically engaged, about the importance of voting and registering to vote. And your community will hear it better and more than they would hear it from someone from outside of the community. So I think, in spreading that information and making sure that folks are engaged and that you're spreading that message specifically from you. So.
This panel has just been so dynamic, and I'm mindful of our time. We'll have to have a part two because there just wasn't enough time to really give everything its full due. We had some additional questions coming in to the chat. As we close, I'd like to give each of our panelists just time to give us maybe 2 to 3 things that we should keep in mind as we move forward, as it relates to not only thinking about Black political power, but also coalitions and, how we really stay involved and get our people in our network involved as well. Dr. Slaughter, can you lead us off? What would be your call to action for this evening?
That's a tall order. There are so many, but for one, I hope no one is intimidated by this conversation and that, you can start where you are. So I guess 2 to 3 things that I would do. One is look up who you're represented by. Many websites just go put in your address to see who your representatives are at the city, county, supervisorial, state, all types of levels to understand who particularly is speaking for you. And then number 2, I think what Kristen said is really important is to be connected to different organizations. So this has been a great platform to bring together people from different organizations, different backgrounds to have a conversation. And we must do more of this, particularly building Black networks, strong Black networks, to say when someone gets up to be a leader, I know them, I can speak for them. Even if you don't agree with them, you can be that person that supports someone else running for office or seeking a political position. So first, know who you're represented by, and 2, get connected to someone.
Thank you. Kristen, what would be your call to action for our attendees tonight?
Yeah, just reiterating the point as far as staying engaged throughout the process. It isn't enough to just vote a candidate in. It isn't enough to just vote for a policy, but throughout that process, make sure that you're holding folks accountable and that you're making sure that these policies are implemented in ways that are really addressing the issues that we really need addressed. And then also continuing to share with your family, make sure that everybody is woke. Everybody needs to be paying attention to these processes and voting and getting involved. And so the more that we spread that word and the importance of getting involved, the more that we have, more folks, a bigger voting base, which wins us policy. So,
thank you, Kristen. Patrice.
I'm going to say a couple of things. One, I think that everyone shares a desire to see strong communities that really offer people stability for quality of life, safety, and then service of government working to serve people that it represents. And in order to attain that, I think that we need to be looking to make sure that we are engaging with our elected leaders and reminding them that they serve us and that we need to make sure that they are delivering the highest quality of service that we deserve in terms of being their constituents. And being able to have that sort of like really ongoing dialogue and engagement with our elected leaders is critical. And if you are the person who is the trusted messenger in your circle, making sure that you are telling other people how they can get involved, how they can get engaged, how they can communicate their concerns if they have them, how they can share ideas as well. Because all ideas for legislation don't come out of the halls of the Capitol or don't come out of City Hall. You know, people like us give their leaders good ideas for policy all the time. So if we're not talking to them, we're not able to help make government work the best way it possibly can. So it can be as simple as, you know, follow your leaders on social media. Shoot them a tweet if you've got a question or have a good idea. You know, just having that sort of very simple communication and have it be open and continuous is probably the most valuable thing that we can all do.
Dr. Samad.
Well, there would be three things. First of all, I hope this is just a part one. We do the one and offs, and we've seen them in our communities. We do them at conferences, and there's generally no follow-up to it. We have to promote intellectualism. As we've seen, we've gone through 4 years of anti-intellectualism, and we see how much damage anti-intellectualism can do. And we have to be the ones to correct that. Secondly, we have to promote public discourse, okay? If we promoted public discourse cannot just be in privileged circles anymore. It has to be across the landscape. Wherever we can reach one, we have to teach one. And we have to make it more than just a moniker. We have to help people understand when people say simple stuff like voting doesn't matter or my vote doesn't count or that kind of stuff. We have to stop and take the time to correct and reverse that mindset. Thirdly, you know, and I say this on all Zooms, we have to become anti-racist. You know, it's not the racists that influence our society. It's those who tolerate racism or who remain silent. And if we're going to partner with people and we're going to coalesce with people, then they cannot be afraid of our community and we can't be afraid of theirs. And A. Philip Randolph used to say that if you're comfortable with my compromise, then you are my oppressor. And sometimes we sit in meetings with people who sit silent in the face of our oppression. And we have to straight up turn to them and ask them, are you comfortable with this? And if you are, then you're part of my problem. And we have to call that out. And that's what we should do.
Well, on that, that's I think a sobering and also an inspiring and empowering point to end on. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us this evening. This has been a dynamic, power-packed conversation. We will definitely have to reconvene for a part 2. To our audience, we'd love for you to stay connected. And if you'd like to follow Dr. Slaughter on Twitter, you can see her handle there at CM Slaughter. Her website is also listed, www.christinemslaughter.com. If you'd like to stay connected to Kristen Nimmers, you can find her at Twitter handle hip2facts or by email at knimmers@calicalls.org. To stay connected to Patrice Marshall McKenzie, you can find her on Facebook and LinkedIn, and her Twitter and IG handle is Patrice M08. And finally, to stay connected to Dr. Samad, you can find him on Facebook and also on Instagram at Dr. Anthony Samad. I want to thank you all. And at this time, I will turn it back over to Madam President.
Well, I don't know what to say except thank you to everyone on our panel for that rich discussion. And I really hope that all of our Participants got some pearls and some nuggets that you can take with you and share widely. As you heard, sharing is so important about the importance of our political engagement as a community and what we need to do to impact the policies that affect our lives. So I want to thank our panelists, Patrice Marshall McKenzie, Dr. Anthony Samad, Dr. Christine Slaughter, and Kristen Nimmers for the valuable information and insights that you shared tonight. But last but certainly not least, I want to thank our moderator, my soror, Sha'Carri Byerly, for leading us through this amazing conversation, and also for all of your behind the scenes support to help create this wonderful forum. I also would like to thank our collaborators, the Los Angeles African American Women Political Action Committee, the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated, and our co-sponsor, Phi Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. All of you, your support was very much appreciated. And you know how these things are. I have to thank our technology team for your amazing support for a seamless program. To stay abreast of all that we have going on, follow Mu Lambda Omega Chapter on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Until we meet again, be safe and tell someone something that you learned about how to stay engaged in political life. So on behalf of Mu Lambda Omega Chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, this concludes our program. Good night.